A view of the planet from space is a fascinating sight. An unforgettable experience is what those who've been here call it. 250 miles above the daily humdrum. This is what a holiday in a space hotel might look like someday in the future. It costs $20 million to fly as a tourist to the ISS, the International Space Station. And so travelling into space remains a dream for most, but one which is gradually coming within grasp. Millionaire Dennis Tito took part in 8 months of strenuous astronaut training. The Americans initially didn't want to let him on the ISS, fearing he might get in the way. But the Russians demanded that the adventurer be admitted to the space station and ultimately got their way. And so, in April of 2001, Dennis Tito, the first space tourist, lifted off from Baikonur Cosmodrome with a Sojus rocket headed towards the ISS. Inside the space station, Tito felt as though in paradise, as he later recalled. The second space tourist was Mark Shuttleworth from South Africa. He visited the space station in April of 2002. Cosmonaut Gitsenko, who was on the ISS with Shuttleworth, doesn't see tourists as a problem. He reports that Russia is in dire need of the millions spent by space tourists in order to keep the cosmic industry, as he puts it, alive. Travel agencies offering space tourism work largely through the internet. Even at this early date, they're attempting to establish themselves in a market which won't become a source of lucrative business for many years. Space adventure is already the uncontested market leader. One German agency works primarily with European space institutions. From watching a rocket lift off to a trip to the ISS. From 2,000 to 20 million US dollars, there's something for almost every budget. The range of choices for adventure and space fans is being continuously expanded. The space tourists of tomorrow will be found in the largest US space center located in Huntsville, Alabama. Visitors come from far and wide in order to get a whiff of history in the making. They want to see the gigantic moon rocket and learn more about America's heroes. This is where you can take a look behind the scenes. For the United States, conquering space and the moon landing are part of national history. Visitors want to be a part of this triumph. The moon lander and the first footprint on the moon are viewed with respect and awe. It was in Rocket City, as Huntsville is sometimes called, that Wernher von Braun built the first rockets for the US Army. Children, young people, and of course adults too, can test their skills at many different displays. Tasks which the astronauts also had to master. Children spend a week at the space camp inside the space park. During this time, they're trained to become junior astronauts. These young astronauts have their rooms in a separate building reserved just for them. Here they can live out their dream of personal space adventure. During the week, the so-called trainees are prepared for a great space shuttle mission. In the shuttle, they assume the tasks of a flight engineer or pilot.
I can do that.
The ground station. A project manager has everything under control. Each of the children is responsible for a particular function here. In the preparatory phase, they learned the basic scientific facts about space travel. And now it's for real. Everyone has to pull together. An error could have catastrophic consequences.
Mission Specialist 3.
The extensive lift-off procedure is carried out with great eagerness and concentration, both at the ground station and in the shuttle.
We're saying, should I do 2.5? I have like 20 seconds.
The children can even take spacewalks. They enthusiastically attach modules to the space station. A statue of people's hero Gagarin stands in the Russian Space Center, the training center for the cosmonauts. About 5,000 people live in Star City. This is also a center of attraction for tourists, mostly from Moscow, who come here to visit the Yuri Gagarin Museum. Gagarin was the very first man in space. In his diaries he wrote, "Remain true to your dreams to the end of your days." And, if you're an aviator, then the skies are your life. The museum's director and an interpreter are tending to the needs of a special guest. Thomas Rice, a businessman in normal life, is a space tourist who's pursuing his dream here. He views the Gagarin Museum with great interest, but the reason for his visit is to be found in the skies over Russia. But more about that later. During his visit, Thomas learns about the difficulties of surviving in space, about muscles that atrophy in weightlessness without physical training, and that Russian cosmonauts initially didn't have spacesuits, at least not until they were the first accident victims. Thomas will be flying with a MiG-29, one of the world's fastest military aircraft. The ride will cost him €12,000, but first it's necessary to establish his airworthiness. The interpreter tells Thomas that the doctor thinks he can see well enough and can fly without glasses. But Thomas refuses because he wouldn't see that certain something.
Nee, dann sehe ich ja das Gewisse nicht.
In the past, he's flown only in slower training jets. The doctor asks how he handled the strain.
Ich war nicht ausgelastet.
Thomas claims that he had not reached his limits. In Huntsville, he once trained in a centrifuge and contended with forces of 2.5 Gs. He felt he could live with that.
Konnte ich noch gut mitleben.
Thomas seems quite composed, but the doctor is of a different opinion when she measures his blood pressure. The interpreter tries to help him and asks him to relax.
Sie regen sich auf, sagt die Ärztin.
I begin to perform
Conference with the pilot. Thomas has decided on an acrobatic flight.
And do step by step more and more difficult maneuvers. I'll show you some instruments, not to remember only for information. And I'll inform you how to use intercom system, how to connect with me. That's important. That's it.
Finally, Thomas has to sign a waiver promising not to seek compensation should something go wrong. An employee of the military airdrome outfits the adventurer. Thomas has to wear anti-G trousers. They're to ensure that he will not pass out later when maximum acceleration values are reached. The helmet and the oxygen supply follow. Then the voice connection, with which Thomas will communicate with the pilot, is checked.
Sie hören sich selbst schlecht, ja? Немножко плохо он слышит себя.
The interpreter asks him whether he can hear himself on the intercom system and asks him to count aloud.
Sagen Sie bitte 1, 2, 3.
And then he's off to the airfield. The first encounter with his object of desire. The MiG-29 is a legendary fighter with a maximum speed of 1,500 miles per hour. Thomas is more than just excited. The preparations for takeoff have been completed.
Thomas, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm fine. I'm still feeling well.
The pilot gives him a few last-minute instructions before takeoff and explains the various instruments.
Ich erwarte also hier doch einiges.
Thomas has great expectations, particularly the forces generated and the enormous speed are to give him the kick he's dreaming about.
Stell dich mal wirklich darunter vor, ja. Es wussten viele, dass ich das
At home, many friends know about his dream, but when everything had fallen into place and he announced that in just 14 days he was to fly in a MiG-29, reactions were muted. He had anticipated more enthusiasm, since for him, this flight was the be-all and end-all, the absolute mega experience. He concluded that either his friends lacked imagination or that simply flying doesn't interest everyone.
Es ist wirklich eine Richtung, die nicht jeden interessiert.
The two jet engines accelerate the 15-ton fighter as though a normal passenger car had been equipped with an 11,000 horsepower engine. When negotiating tight curves, the acceleration forces are so great that Thomas is exposed to 5 times his own body weight. The flight computer ensures that his anti-G trousers are inflated in order to press blood back upwards from the legs to ensure the oxygen supply to the brain. Space tourism has not yet fully developed, says Thomas, but he's been excited about the subject for years. He's read a great deal about space travel. He'd like to at least see the Earth from space and experience weightlessness. If this should become affordable in the foreseeable future, he would love to make the trip. He hopes to have another 20 or 25 years during which he will be healthy and fit enough to handle such exertions. By that time, the prices for space tourism, hopefully, would have dropped to the point where he can afford it. He will definitely consider it.
Danke. Wie war's?
Sehr gut.
Thomas asks how high the acceleration forces were and learns that he was exposed to 5 Gs. That means that during the flight he weighed 400 kilograms, at least for a moment or two. When asked how he enjoyed the flight, Thomas explains that it was awesome, that it can't be described in words. He had, however, anticipated that he would have sensed the enormous speed more. In an automobile, you really feel like you're moving fast at 130 miles an hour, but in a jet you feel nothing. There are no reference points, there's just air out there. A passenger cabin is to be mounted on the successor model, a MiG-31. This jet is supposed to fly from Munich to Mallorca and climb to heights of 19 miles, 3 times the altitude reached by commercial aircraft. People in Germany are working on this idea at present. The ticket for this unusual view will cost about 10,000 euros. The launch of the Endeavour space shuttle. The high cost of these flights are due to the enormous technical challenges. In order to break away from the Earth's gravitation and enter orbit, the shuttle has to reach a velocity of 17,500 miles per hour. For this, supplementary rockets, so-called boosters, are required, and immense quantities of fuel, which also have to be accelerated until the supply is exhausted. To reach the necessary speed, the empty tanks are cast off and not retrieved. All the materials needed in space, such as food, air and water, have to be carried on board. At present, the shipping costs for each kilogram are $20,000. The loads at takeoff and the heat during re-entry into the atmosphere are so great that the shuttle requires a 3-month overhaul after each flight. This is one of the reasons why every launch costs about $400 million. Tourism experts are assuming that the interest in space travel will rise as prices drop. At $20 million US, they estimate that there are about 10 interested parties. At $1 million, there might be 10,000 potential passengers. And at prices of $100,000, they're assuming that there will be hundreds of thousands of interested space tourists. In the interest of reducing prices for space tourism, private sponsors announced the X Prize, valued at $10 million US. 26 contestants from around the world submitted their applications. They've worked out various concepts for reusable spaceships. Cars normally drive right by the tiny desert town of Mojave, California. It's hardly more than a wide spot in the road. But in June of 2004, more than 20,000 people arrived to see the launch of the first privately owned spaceship, which is to bring tourists to the periphery of space. In the past, space technology had been reserved only for government organizations.
This is history in the making. You should be here. You could go up there someday. If you got your $20,000 in there, you can take a ride up there too. Not me, though.
You wouldn't do it?
No. I don't even go on.
What if it was free?
I don't even go on the Disneyland rides anymore. These are my grandchildren. This is my daughter. This is my grandson. This is his girlfriend. So they might do it, yes. Well, you know what? This one will, because he's Mr. Daredevil anyway. So yes, if he has the money, he's going. Yes, I can bet on that.
Press conference one day before the launch. Paul Allen, co-founder of Microsoft, has backed this project to the tune of about $25 million. To win the X Prize, a spaceship with room for 3 persons has to reach an altitude of 60 miles twice within a short period. Well-known aviation engineer Burt Rutan designed and built an extremely unusual reusable aircraft.
We found that every time we went to NASA for help, getting their help meant that I couldn't stay under the budget that I promised Mr. Allen. So we decided very early that we had to do this all on our own. If NASA, for example, was flying this flight tomorrow, it's not noticed. So there's no significance of this flight. I think we'd have a much smaller crowd here if NASA was going to do a suborbital space flight tomorrow. The significance is the realization that, hey, this is for us to do now. This is not only for governments to do. And so, hold on. The next 25 years will be a wild ride. That's my prediction.
The resonance next morning is indeed impressive. 600 journalists from around the world want to report on the first takeoff of a private spaceship.
Or 62.5 miles. Let me just show you a little bit of animation here and how this works. Particular craft 8 times before on other tests.
The flight takes place on the morning of June the 21st, 2004. The tension mounts. Up to now, most of the spectators have only seen photographs of the spaceship.
Privately funded manned spaceflight. Isn't that a beautiful airplane?
The aircraft configuration comprises the White Knight carrier aircraft and, slung below it, Spaceship One, in which eventually 2 tourists are to sit behind the pilot.
How exciting.
The launch system that Burt Rutan developed within just 2 years takes off like a normal airplane. Later, this spaceship will be taking off once a week. Initially, a ticket will cost $100,000 and later $10,000 per flight.
I think that every hair is standing up on the back of my neck. And here we have officially, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, launch.
The tourist shuttle is released at an altitude of just under 10 miles. The pilot starts the novel hybrid engine in Spaceship One, accelerating to almost 2,000 miles an hour. The rocket burns out after 80 seconds. A few minutes later, the zenith, about 60 miles above the ground, has been reached. Zero gravity prevails. In order to slow the craft significantly before re-entry into the atmosphere, the rear part of the wing is raised. The rocket will not become quite so hot when it encounters the denser layers of air. Consequently, Spaceship One can return to Earth safely without need for the delicate tiles that make up the heat shield. With the craft's wings folded back, the pilot of Spaceship One slowly sails down to the runway without power and accompanied by observer aircraft.
Spaceship One recovered on 30 right.
There it is, a craft that has been to space and back today, right
The
in front of you.
concept for this configuration is as revolutionary as it is safe. The conventional takeoff is uncomplicated. No heat shield is needed for re-entry, and the rocket engine is simple, safe, and reliable.
The rocket motor that SpaceDev developed along with scaled composites for Spaceship One is unique because it uses a solid fuel and a liquid oxidizer, but even more unique than that is the fact that the fuel is related to automobile tire rubber, and the oxidizer, to make it burn, is nitrous oxide, N2O, or commonly known as laughing gas, used in medical offices as an anesthetic. So it's a safe combination. The rocket motor can't explode because it's half solid and half liquid. Neither one of them are poisonous or explosive or dangerous. So it's a revolutionary motor and ideally suited for human spaceflight.
Pilot Mike Melville, at 60, is quite beside himself. He reports on the spectacular view and raves about letting brightly coloured candies float around in the cockpit during the weightless phase. At the airfield, all those involved are euphoric, a feeling comparable only to the moon landing. The hope now is that space will soon be open for tourism. The journalists attempt to assess the event. It's obvious that the race for the first space station of the future has begun. The American Aviation Authority promptly declares Mojave to be the first spaceport in the USA.
Welcome to America's first inland spaceport. You're like,
Bravo!
Shortly after this initial triumph, Burt Rutan and his crew repeat the flight of Spaceship One twice, and as a result were awarded the X Prize on October the 4th, 2004.
Right here, Mike.
Only a few hundred yards away, the deserted halls of the Rotary Rocket Company bear witness to the fact that there were also losers in this competition. And this is what the Vision looked like. An unusual launch vehicle, 19 meters tall and dubbed Roton by its engineers, takes off. With just a few people in the ground station, the intention was to send up a flight every 1 or 2 days at very low costs. The rocket engine is powered with kerosene and liquid oxygen. It rotates at 700 RPM inside its cowling and thus develops the high pressure needed to pump the fuels into the combustion chamber. At the end of the mission, rotor blades are swung outward. Even though they're not driven, they reduce the velocity and thus the heating of the rocket when it re-enters the atmosphere. Heavy heat shields are not necessary. Just before touchdown, small rockets are started at the rotor blades. With the lift they provide, Roton can set down on lightweight landing gear. At the time, the engineers were convinced that their ideas would work in the real world and could be implemented with the Cessna bug jet, which was already available. This proved to be an expensive mistake. Dan DeLong works at the Mojave Airport too. He and his company XCOR also intend to build a space shuttle for tourists. Right now, the launch vehicle looks more like a sports plane. It's a technological demonstrator used to develop the rocket engine.
Before 500 psi, but
this pump's the one that's under development.
Yes, propellants to both engines.
Dan explains the design to a visitor.
System, regulators for the pressure on both the fuel and oxidizer tanks, electronic controller for sequencing the engine startup and shutdown, chill down valves, and inside the blast shield, of course, we have the business end of the rocket engine.
They call this modern flying machine the Easy Rocket. It can reach altitudes of 10,000 feet, but during development they never lost sight of their target, building a space-worthy vehicle.
Engine chamber pressures.
This rocket-powered craft will one day be called Xerus. It's to achieve high speeds and reach suborbital altitudes. In addition to tourists, XCOR wants to put miniature satellites in orbit. Moreover, they want to use their economical flight system for scientific experiments carried out at zero gravity. But there's still a long way to go. What problems still need to be solved?
Well, there's several technical problems, but there's also the problem of regulatory risk, and that is, if we built the vehicle, how do we know that we'll be allowed to fly it? Well, we've reduced that regulatory risk by getting this launch license. It's only the second one ever issued for a reusable launch vehicle. Of course, Spaceship One has the first. And we got this just to prove to potential investors that if we build it, we'd be allowed to fly. And in having this launch license, it means that we can fly a rocket-powered vehicle, it means that we can make money, And it does not yet mean that we can carry passengers. We expect to get an amendment to do that in the near future.
But back to everyday business. Because right now X4 is involved primarily in improving the rocket drive, with a considerable boost in its performance.
Okay. And we're starting to get a soot buildup, but it still looks nice and radially symmetrical.
Yep.
A test flight. Easy rocket can be piloted just as easily as a conventional aircraft. There's no need to monitor the rocket drive over and above normal flying techniques. Using this technology demonstrator, X-Corps wants to prove that it can develop an aircraft which is safe, simple, cheap, and above all, reliable. For instance, the rocket drive can be switched off and back on during flight, something which is not normally the case. This increases safety. The pilot for the development phase is Dick Rutan, the brother of Burt Rutan, the developer of Spaceship One. The X-Corps project will also help to drastically reduce the costs for reaching space. Dragojani is a small town in the Wallachia region of Romania. Young engineers built their rocket in this garden. They're competing with Spaceship One. The Western press sometimes ridiculed them as backyard astronauts. Nonetheless, the test rocket is to lift off for the first time on September the 9th, 2004 at an army testing facility on the Black Sea. Dumitru Popescu, an aviation and aerospace student, heads up the ARCA team. Both financing and technical equipment are scanty. At the first test launch, there was only a little bit of steam to be seen. Something went wrong, but what? Nobody seems to know for sure. As it turns out, the fuel line has become loose. The launch is delayed until the following day, and the rocket is repaired overnight. The weather has taken a turn for the worse. The sky has become stormy.
They will pressurize the fuel tank in maximum 1 minute.
After lengthy preparations, the countdown is to begin in 2 or 3 minutes. And suddenly, the rocket lifts off, with no prior warning, but straight as an arrow toward the planned height of about 1 mile. Now it just has to descend within the calculated radius. A parachute system will be installed only for one of the later test rockets. Aside from the premature start, it was a success. I'm quite happy, says Simona, the press spokesperson. What else can I say? The first phone contact to the launch ramp. The fuel hose had become detached again and fell on a contact. That was what triggered the early start. It was always clear to Dumitru that without financial backing he had no hope of winning the contest against American multimillionaires. And he's nonetheless optimistic. Today we've proved that the engine works, he says. The next test could take place in 2005. And if everything goes well, he adds, then the first manned flight could lift off in 2006. I don't know to what altitude, certainly not all the way into space, but at least half the distance. A final photograph documents the Romanian attempt to get space tourism off the ground. The British government terminated rocket development more than 30 years ago. Steve Bennett regretted that. He gave up his permanent job to found the Starchaser company. He too is a contestant for the X Prize, But the competition is only of marginal interest to him. His primary objective is to develop rockets with which tourists can someday fly into space.
You know when you taught me to make those drawings of the mechanism?
But that can't be done without money. Souvenir sales, admission fees for visitors' tours, and above all, sponsors are to bring in new money for the technical development of the rockets. So much to his regret, Steve is often involved in fundraising. What he and his enthusiastic team have been able to accomplish under these conditions is quite amazing.
This is the Nova Starchaser 4 rocket. It's the biggest rocket ever launched from the UK mainland. We launched it back in 2001. We got it just a few thousand feet up, put it through its paces and brought it back safely on parachute.
Widely publicised competitions are also to bring in some money for further development. Here, an associate is working on the entry port for a larger capsule, one which is also to carry passengers. This is no simple task, since the port has to be completely airtight when closed. That requires absolute mechanical precision. In the meantime, a model is being made up in the hall. Rockets, too, first need to be built out of wood. Together with his team, Steve has developed numerous tanks and various liquid fuel engines. The most powerful of them generates 15 tons of thrust. Starchaser also develops rockets for scientific use.
This is the Starchaser Discovery research rocket. We launched this back in the year 2000. It's designed as a two-stage rocket to get small payloads up to high altitudes. For the first flight we had a camera in the nose cone which worked very well. Okay, this is the Nova Mark II capsule. We used it for parachute drop tests. What we did was we put one man in here and we threw this capsule out the back of an aeroplane. That's an altitude of about 10,000 feet. This was done over in Arizona, over the Red Lake drop zone in July last year. And we did a few tests like this. The pilot deploys a big parachute, a big steerable canopy, and then he can fly it back to a controlled runway landing. We did this test a couple of times to prove that the craft is reusable. We got some very good results from it.
The milkman already knows the routine. When he makes his rounds in the wee hours, the rocket builders are getting ready to start. The mission might look a bit curious, but the neighbours have got used to the odd rocket driving past their windows. We move right across Manchester to a school which the rocket and the Starchaser team have rented for a day. A film is shown in the school auditorium. The young people are disciplined, but are they actually interested? They're confronted with a topic that has little to do with their everyday world. I'd never thought about possibly working in space travel, a pupil said later. During his speech, John Kelly also mentions the X Prize. He talks about space travel and explains the laws of physics on which it's based.
What's the highest? Well, to answer that, what's the furthest?
A question and answer period for the youngest kids in the school.
Past, you can't really talk about height. You're talking a distance from the Earth, and that would be the moon.
A photographer from the local press is also on hand. He sets up a picture.
And a couple more.
The Hercules of the New Age.
And last one, smile.
Break is in a few minutes. The rocket is put in place. The income generated by this school event will go towards developing the rockets. But it's not just a matter of money.
As of late in Britain, we've suffered a shortage of engineers, skilled technicians, as we've turned towards more service-based culture. One of our main priorities is to get more people into British engineering and science, specifically engineering, as there is a shortage in this sector. Hopefully, if we do that now, in 10 years' time, we'll have more engineers coming through which can take up the jobs in the European Space Agency and space industries that are created through the Starchaser franchise.
The good old Ilyushin is a rugged aircraft and particularly well suited for so-called zero-G or parabolic flight. In flight, the airplane alternates between extreme nose-high and nose-low attitudes. A brief period of weightlessness is created. This tends to affect people in different ways. Andreas Bergweiler has also had this experience. Andreas calls himself space crazy. You could almost call it an illness, which in his case was triggered by an infection in early childhood.
Oh, das ist mein Vater schuld. Der hat mich 1969 aus dem Bett geholt, wie Neil Armstrong auf dem Mond gelandet
He blames his father.
Und
He
seitdem
got
hat
the
mich
boy
dieses
out of
Thema
bed when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon.
im Laufe der
Since then, he's been obsessed by the subject. In the course of the following years, his desire to fly to the stars himself grew. And a few years ago, he was given the opportunity, the first civilian who is not a member of a crew, to take part in astronaut training in Sochi.
an einem Astronautentraining in Sochi teilzunehmen.
The training scenario. The Sojus capsule has landed in the water as a result of a steering fault. The cosmonauts have to put on their survival suits inside the cramped and unbearably hot capsule. The men climb out of the tiny port. They attract the attention of their rescuers. And there it is, this feeling of euphoria.
Das war zum ersten Mal dieses
That was the incredible feeling of being part of a crew for the first time, says Andreas. It was a hands-on experience and provided actual contact with real space travel in Russia. Following the zero-gravity flight, survival training and a flight with a MiG, Andreas enters the centrifuge to experience acceleration forces like those developed during a rocket launch.
Also zuerst mal, man ist festgeschnallt, ganz eng, also wie in einem Jet. Man kann sich kaum bewegen.
The first step is to be strapped down tight, as in a jet fighter. Andreas Bergweiler recalls that he could barely move. You hold a joystick in your hand, not too firmly, it's only for emergencies. You don't actually realize when the centrifuge begins to rotate. You only know something's going on when the force starts bearing down on your chest and increases all the time. It's as though you'd been jumped by a monster without any warning. You realize there's something there, but you can't define it. Then your eyes begin to move back and forth. You attempt to focus on a point in front of you. There's a small panel in front of you with a cross on it. You try to focus on that. The force becomes greater and greater until it becomes almost unbearable. The interpreter in the control room reads off the load. At 4 Gs, she asks Andreas to wave his hand. At first, he doesn't respond. He remembers. At some point, the people in the control room were satisfied and said, OK, he's had enough. G4 or 5 or 6, or in my case, it was 7.8. And then I could let go of my joystick. And the feeling afterward is as though you'd been underwater the entire time and then realized you're running out of oxygen and have to get back to the surface. That was something like the very first breath. Wow, I've survived. All the facilities are located in the Yuri Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center. Here, Andreas Bergweiler has turned his passion into a profession. He uses his contacts to familiarize space tourists with Russian space endeavors. Here he shows Thomas Rice the training module for the Mir space station. Andreas explains the Mir basic module to Thomas. It's identical with the ISS. At 21.7 tons, it was one of the heaviest objects ever to be lifted into space. There's the dining table. It contains enough food for a few months during a mission.
Sinn und Zweck dieses Tisches war, hier ist das Essen drin für ein paar Monate.
The training center was actually conceived only for astronaut training. But in the meantime, tourists have started training here too. The attraction of this adventure appears to be surviving great exertion and the severe testing. The tourists have to pay dearly for this experience. Inside the Sojus capsule, Andreas tells Thomas that he's sitting in the seat for the third cosmonaut, the space tourist seat. Thomas is excited. This is where Shuttleworth and Tito sat too.
Was ist der Space Touristenplatz?
Shuttleworthplatz.
Richtig, genau. Ja. Also hier trainieren die Astronauten im polaren Raumanzug Schwerelosigkeit, im Wasser, unter Wasser, durch genauso ausbalancieren, Auftrieb, Abtrieb.
Then Andreas shows the submersion basin, where the cosmonauts train with the Orlan spacesuit. He points out the modules mounted in the pool. Those modules are just like the ones for the ISS and are mounted on an underwater platform which can be raised and lowered. The cosmonauts can get accustomed to space conditions here, since the motions they execute underwater are similar to those they'll experience in weightlessness. Divers assist the cosmonauts. Visions of a space hotel. The results of a competition among architecture students at Darmstadt Technical University. It presents a real challenge for the architects, since the usual structures such as walls, ceilings and floors no longer exist. There are areas with and without weightlessness. As fantastic as the proposals might seem, they all take account of the laws of physics and could actually be built. In order to lower the price of space travel and speed up the construction of space hotels, it's possible, as the X-Prize contestants did, to develop new and less expensive rocket systems. But it's also possible to draw upon existing technologies such as the Space Shuttle, with its gigantic tanks and boosters, manufacturing them in large numbers to cut costs. This is the approach being followed by the Space Island Group.
We believe that the hardware that has been developed by NASA in the United States could be used to build very large commercial facilities in orbit if those components were managed by a private industry company instead of by a government agency.
The tanks for the space shuttle are to be fitted with drives and, in space, serve as the basic modules for space factories and space hotels. The facilities will be financed by companies interested in using production facilities in zero-gravity conditions to develop special products, and by tourists. They're promised an exciting vacation on the space station.
We could actually put one of these stations into an endless figure-8 orbit between the Earth and the Moon. It would take about 45 minutes for it to swing around the backside of the Earth, and during that time we could transfer passengers on and off. The trip to the Moon would take about 3 days, and it would take again about 45 minutes to an hour to pass around the backside of the Moon. So we could drop passengers off onto hotels on the Moon or research centers or factories on the surface of the Moon during that time, and then the station would continue on back to Earth 3 days later. So the whole trip would take about a week. So it'd be a very interesting vacation.
This space hotel was developed in 2000 by the Astrium organization. At some point in the distant future, 120 tourists will spend 4 days in this highly unusual hotel. The package price is projected at $280,000 US. 20,000 guests are to visit the hotel each year. There are a host of concepts for space hotels. However, one thing is certain. It will be a long, long time before they become reality and tourism actually conquers space.